Why do we prune fruit trees, folks? So it can promote some growth, space, cutting off disease, but also maybe airflow so that the sun and the air can get in there. Better quality fruit. In nature, trees fruit naturally. Their priority is not necessarily to grow juicy fruit for us to eat. Their priority is to grow fruit to reproduce, but also to get up to the sun and keep their fruit away from animals. Pruning is really something we do for our purposes again, rather than the fruit tree's purposes necessarily. But most of the fruit trees you buy these days are grafted, so they've got a selected cultivar on a rootstock that's tough and disease resistant, but more fruit that's edible. The grafting has been a real sort of coup for good fruit production. So normally you'll have a graft union somewhere on your tree where it was grafted onto the rootstock, and then you'll have your limbs or branches, which really are there designed to be the framework and to hold things up and be strong. You'll have your laterals, which is where all the fruit comes off. The top growth is leaders. If you prune your fruit trees really well from a young age, you should never need anything more than a pair of secateurs, and you should never need to do a cut more than about a pencil thickness. Most of us don't do that, so we have to do bigger cuts. Long-handled loppers are really good, and they cut bigger branches than the seckies quite easily. A good pruning saw, if you're doing thicker branches, is really good. And when it comes to sharpening, you just need to kind of go over them with a stone just lightly on the edge. Don't do it on the inside that hits the flat blade, because then it creates a gap, which means it's not tight, and then your wood gets mashed. A tree will only have so much resources, so much energy, and it has to share those between one of two processes, either growing more vegetation or growing more fruit. We really want to get a balance of those two things. When they're young, we're more encouraging vegetative growth. As they get older, we're more trying to encourage fruiting. In the beginning, you want a strong framework that's going to be able to hold all of this fruiting branches. And normally, the way that you encourage vegetative growth is you prune more in winter. The harder you prune, the stronger it's going to grow back. When you prune a branch and you knock it down to the point where there's a bud, the next bud, that's where its next strong growth point is going to come from. And that will create that initial branching that happens there. So you're basically just pruning it at that stage just to encourage where you want your next strong limbs to grow. The one mistake I see a lot of people make is they prune too high early on. If it's really established, sometimes you have to take a chainsaw to it and you prune back to just like some low limbs, and then it'll shoot. In order to get your plants to grow vigorously, like that is winter pruning. So when you summer prune, you are not creating such an imbalance between the roots and the top, and you don't tend to get this strong, vigorous growth response. And so a lot of the time people will prune in summer to contain their trees, but also to try and encourage fruiting. Every fruit tree has an age of wood that it fruits on. Like peaches and nectarines only fruit on 1-year-old wood, and your apples and pears can fruit on wood for many years. What you want to do is you've got to get to know your tree. If you know what age wood is that it fruits on, you want to kind of keep your tree producing that sort of wood. So that cut that we do when we've just got one stem, that's called a heading cut. And heading cuts are quite sort of dramatic in a way. You know, there's different times you would use different cuts. So if, for instance, your tree is growing really tall and you do a heading cut, it's going to cause it to grow new buds from that side thing. Whereas if you can find a branch that's already angling off and do one of those, then it's less dramatic and it won't grow quite as fast. When you're pruning, you're pruning it back, if it hasn't got a bud that it can grow from, that whole limb's going to die. So you're always looking at your buds and you're looking where they're pointing, how healthy they are, and then you're cutting above those to try and get your new growth. Some real basics. I always call it the 3 Ds and the Cs. So disease, damage and deadwood. Crossing, congested, crowded. Don't start at the top. You take one limb at a time and you go and find the place where you're going to make the bottom cut. You kind of want on your main limb a good balance of laterals and strong ones. As a lateral gets old, you need to regenerate it. So you prune it back to a bud so that it can grow another lateral. So that you'll do that in winter. Whereas the thinning and the shortening you do after they've flowered.